Welcome. This is our fourth session of Crosspaths in our study of Be the Bridge 101, foundational principles every white bridge builder needs to understand. Your invitation, stated on the cover of your materials, is that we join together in welcoming diversity and healing into our communities. In this session, we focus on the third of the four W's, having discussed white identity, white privilege, and next week, white supremacy. Today, white fragility. Now, full disclosure here, just between you and me, the moment I read fragility, my defensiveness goes into overdrive. Now, you can call me vulnerable, especially when I choose to be. You can call me sensitive, kind of like that. You can even call me out when I'm being defensive, but just don't call me fragile. I can be vulnerable, sensitive, and defensive and still be rugged, strong, courageous, resilient. But fragile? That's a blow to my ego, a blow to my self-assurance and my self-confidence. You call me fragile and it's either fight or flight, battle engaged or end of conversation. So, I'm not particularly a fan of talking about white fragility, and I personally think we could have a better conversation if we called it white defensiveness instead. But once again, I need to ask myself, is this because indeed the difficult word fragile is the one I need to hear? Fragile. Is there something about the descriptor fragile that makes me feel fragile enough to realize I need some healing? I need some repair. I might be overly sensitive. And if it is true about me, who's entering into this conversation willingly and hoping to keep an open mind and ear, how true will it be for someone who is not especially keen about having a conversation about race? Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who invented the term white fragility in a paper she wrote about racial inequality in 2011, has responded to all of the pushback she's received through the years from white people as she was asked to work in corporate settings and other settings, trying to give guidance and feedback on racism in the workplace. She made a list of what she perceives are the, quote, unwritten rules of engagement if you choose to talk with other white people about racism. Now, I'm hoping she says them with tongue in cheek, but I suspect not. She says, the first and most important rule for engagement with a white person about racism, you don't give them any feedback on their racism under any circumstances. 2, if you break rule number 1, and you do it anyway, it must be given calmly with no emotion or it's invalid. It makes me uncomfortable. I'm done listening. I'm out of here. 3rd, you must believe that there isn't a racist bone in my body. I have black friends. 4th, you must never give me feedback publicly in a group or it's invalid. I'll deny it. I'll stop listening. I'll walk away. 5, you must be as indirect as possible, and I must feel safe and comfortable at all times. 6th rule of engagement, you must be willing to recognize all the ways I've been oppressed, how I've never been given any privileges or advantages that I didn't earn, and life hasn't been fair to me. 7th rule, my good intentions and the fact that I'm a good person cancel out any negative impact caused by my behavior or words. And finally, to suggest my behavior has any racist impact at all is to misunderstand me. And it makes me really, really uncomfortable. Well, in summary, Dr. DiAngelo said this: after years of working with my fellow whites, I have found that the only way to give feedback correctly is not to give it at all. As I've said in previous sessions, I'm late to this conversation. I've had a lot to learn. I've been reading, I've been discussing, I've been digesting, wrestling with the history and the reality of racial injustice, and I am still just scratching the surface. I am no expert. And I've also been reading and listening to those who speak from the other side of the aisle, who criticize those of us who suggest we have a racial problem or are somehow part of creating or maintaining it. I don't want to be in a bubble of one-sided information. And what I've come to realize is this. While I have always read extensively, I've got 12 years of college and postgraduate study behind me, I imagine myself to be a perpetual student. I follow current events. I've a pretty healthy BS monitor when consuming mass media. I've immersed myself in Bible and theology for over 40 years, and I've come to this. Despite all that, I and most white colleagues are racially illiterate. And when it comes to the racial history of our country, we are pathetically uneducated. And frankly, we're indoctrinated in the superiority of European and white ancestry. And when the criticism comes that we're trying to rewrite history now, truth is, I think we're finally trying to get it right and tell the truth about what is indeed our shared history. And thirdly, when it comes to learning about racial injustice and white privilege, most of us white folks are disinterested at best or vehemently opposed at worst. And that brings me back to the topic of fragility. If you want to make me feel defensive, tell me I'm illiterate, I'm uneducated, or I'm disinterested, and see where that goes. But folks, I've come to realize that is indeed true. It is part and parcel of why people of color are tired. They're wearied, they're frustrated as they try to make their case for change and for justice. When they proclaim that Black Lives Matter, and someone responds to them that all lives matter or blue lives matter, it's not that those folks are saying something that isn't true. All lives do matter. Blue lives do matter. But it's as though I've just confided in you that I've got cancer, and you ignore my pain and you respond, well, you know lots of people who've had cancer, and if I were to share with you that my marriage is falling apart, and you come back about how difficult you have it lately at home, what you're really doing is just shutting me down. You're silencing me. When faced with hard realities, most of us just want to be heard, to be cared about, supported in our pain. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. To know that you're willing to come alongside us to give us strength. And frankly, when somebody says all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, it's a lie until there's more evidence that Black lives do. I'll tell you this, if somebody confides in you that they've got cancer or their marriage is falling apart, what you need to do is step outside of yourself. It's not about you. What you need to do is say, oh, I'm so sorry, tell me more. How can I help? And listen, ask questions. You don't come back and say, well, lots of people get cancer, or I've got this pain in my abdomen, or every marriage has its hardships. You're shutting people down. And if that's what you've been doing, knock it off. You're better than that. You know better than that. What this idea of white fragility exposes in us is all the defensive reactions we get when challenged to know and understand and own our white identities, and acknowledge that it does indeed confer certain privileges, and that the history we've been taught assumes white European ancestry and Christian supremacy. One doesn't have to be overtly racist or extremist to find that one is accepted as a norming norm that whiteness and maleness and Christianity and heterosexuality are the standard by which all others are being measured, by which all others are being valued, that this is how our present systems work. When someone criticizes and seeks to remove statues or names connected to our racist past, they're not guilty of attempting to rewrite history, but of finally trying to get history right and hold all of us collectively accountable to the values and ideals that we set forth in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, in our preaching, and in our following of Jesus. I think we really do want to believe that this country is a true meritocracy, that justice is colorblind, neutral. But the evidence is painfully otherwise. And to say that it's not provokes responses of fragility and defensiveness. Now, Can you honestly believe that 92% of Fortune 500 CEOs are men and 99% are white solely on account of merit? Can we actually believe that? Can we believe that there's no systemic racism when in the 500 largest American companies there are 5 black CEOs? In 2019, there were 3 black senators, no black governors, 1 black cabinet member in the White House. Can we believe that there is no systemic racism? I grew up hearing over and over from teachers and parents that there was nothing I couldn't do, nothing I couldn't be if I put my mind to it. That there was, in fact, this level playing field where all that matters is my efforts, hard work, and commitment. America is a meritocracy, and failure to reach any of my goals was all on me. You think about it, that's a really bizarre statement. And it's bizarre enough to instill in a young white male. But how do you suppose that's heard? And more significantly, how do you suppose that is experienced among women, people of color, recent immigrants, and those whose religion is not Christian? According to Dr. Christina Edmondson, who's studied and written about Christian nationalism in our current context, and how the growing phenomenon of Christian nationalism tends to define what it is to be truly American, she says this: according to a Christian nationalist, to be truly American is to be an evangelical Protestant, theologically, politically conservative, white, and an American-born citizen, as opposed to an immigrant. The idea of white fragility emerges because of the awareness that most of us whites have not built up the racial stamina or the interest to engage in the discussion and debate without feeling threatened or labeled. And our most common responses in this fragility are anger, denial, fear, guilt, silence, argumentation, or just walking away and refusing to engage. We've also seen how some have responded by turning the tables and saying that, well, it's really whites who are being oppressed these days. We're being discriminated against. We're being marginalized. It's the wealthy who are being unfairly treated, and it's especially white males who are being persecuted and stereotyped to the point that everyone else is getting preferential treatment. The fact that most of our congregation lives in one of the least diverse zip codes in the country means that many of us have never had to deal with the issue of racism personally, or have had to think about it honestly and critically. Most of us tend not to think of the lack of diversity as a loss to us. And sadly, some I've heard say, will even go so far as to say that it's what makes our neighborhoods safer or our schools better. Talk about white fragility. I think it's more and more true that when white voices start challenging racial injustice, it's increasing white resistance to acknowledge complicity. And when the subject of systemic changes being needed come up, the anxiety and the resistance just go through the roof. Most of us really want to be perceived as being racially tolerant, accepting. We want to stake our reputations and our moral integrity as being different than those white supremacists. We have a really hard time admitting our participation, the way we benefit from systems of white domination. When someone suggests that we have, that we are, it triggers that defensiveness and indignation that are symptoms of our fragility. As some have suggested, a part of white privilege is our ability to choose to avoid any conversations about it. If it makes us uncomfortable, we can walk away. We can dismiss the relevance or reality of racism with few or no apparent consequences, we think. I think that perhaps one of our biggest barriers to change, or even openness to discuss structural and systemic racism, is that too often the conversations start there. And we haven't done the necessary groundwork of assisting white folks like me with understanding and embracing that we have a white identity and that there is white privilege. And that's not a criticism of your morality or a denial of whatever hardships you may have endured or how hard you have worked to achieve your goals, but to start discussions with the issue of changing systems and macro level problems without first starting at the personal level of owning my own whiteness and my own assets of white privilege. Start talking about systems. It's like trying to hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball before you even know which end of the bat to grip. It's in the work that you are doing individually and in your small groups, and then one-to-one with your peers, that the foundation is built upon which meaningful change can occur and discussion about systems can happen. Jesus once taught his disciples that those who try to save their lives lose it, and those who lose their lives save it. It's one of the many paradoxical sayings of Jesus that have resulted in a range of responses from avoidance to martyrdom. What I hear in this saying is that there are times when we are so hard fighting to preserve what is and what we have and what we want, that we lose out on the opportunity for that more abundant life. Not necessarily, usually not more abundance, but abundant life. A life that's opened up to the possibilities God would lead us towards. I think of all the times I've sat with folks who, after a lifetime of working so hard at providing for families and succeeding in their careers, that they lament having missed their children growing up. They watch their retirement savings grow while failing to invest in their marriages. They became experts or accomplished in their fields, but they have no clue who they are or what they've become. And in trying to save, protect, and enhance life on their own terms, they lost out on the abundant life Jesus would have sought to give. There's a story the Apostle Paul tells in the 2nd chapter of his letter to the Galatians, where he shares how he had to get in Peter's face and challenge him for his fragility. It seems Peter had been moved by the gospel to draw his circle wider. Peter began to share table fellowship with non-Jews in the city of Antioch, clearly crossing racial, ethnic, religious boundaries. But it opened up a whole new view for Peter's faith and witness. But then one day, when other Jews from Jerusalem came to visit, Peter knew that this would make them uncomfortable. So he broke off that table fellowship. He was afraid it would get him in trouble with this certain faction back home. Apostle Paul was furious. He asked Peter, how does this represent in any way the gospel of Jesus? And he called Peter a hypocrite. Now, no doubt this made Peter even more uncomfortable than he was when he was afraid of being outed for his progressive and liberal lived out grace. But Peter overcame his fragility. We read in Acts 11, Peter went on to become one of the strongest advocates for changed relationships, systems, hospitality between Jew and Gentile, to live in that miracle of new life in Christ. Peter needed to be willing to let go of that part of his life and his faith that had become a barrier and a threat to the expression of justice and grace. Peter needed to overcome his fragility, his defensive posture, in order to lean into the gospel and a more inclusive grace. Through these sessions with you, I've become more aware of my white identity, the privileges attendant with it. I celebrate that identity. There are aspects of it that I'm proud of. I embrace it. I want to better understand how it affects not only me, but those who are not like me. And I want to be a better listener. I want to be a better encourager, advocate for those whose stories and experiences are different than mine, who don't have my privileges, so that I can both learn from them and better model the Spirit of Jesus. I want to acknowledge my fragility and better understand and hear more from those who are not like me and how their lives are affected by white identity and by white privilege run amok, by white privilege that is toxified into white supremacy, creating resistance and people retreating into silence and apathy. I don't want to retreat into silence or apathy again, just because I'm uncomfortable or it makes me feel a bit fragile. And I want to be aware enough that when I do feel fragile, that I would remember what Paul said Jesus told him in 2 Corinthians 12:9. Jesus said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in fragility." To which Paul then says, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." My prayer is that your small groups tonight would be filled with fragility and God's grace.